The history of the United States is a violent one. The seizure of the North American landmass from the Aboriginal inhabitants was a decidedly violent and genocidal undertaking. The use of African chattel slavery and free labor to create the foundation for America's wealth and prosperity, and to launch the Industrial Revolution in North America, was steeped in ruthless cruelty and maintained by an omnipresent threat of violence. Early 20th century projections of the U.S. power into Central America, the Caribbean, and elsewhere proceeded in the wake of gunboats and relied upon the bayonets of soldiers and Marines. The cliche that the West was won by the six-shooter, by the gun, is often glorified in American folklore. White Americans, the settlers that exterminated the native peoples, that stole their land, that erected the Republic of the United States out of a colonial enterprise, had almost a religious addiction to firearms and guns. Indeed, they said that God created man and Samuel Colt made him equal. God created man, and the gun manufacturer Samuel Colt, guns made human beings equal. This is the mentality of white America. This mentality has persisted from its earliest inception to this very day. It has been argued by historians and sociologists alike that early American westward expansion created a uniquely American fascination with guns and violence, and the resort to force as the arbiter of conflict. I wanted you to understand that where I grew up, where I came from, was a nation that worshiped power and violence. That violence, as Imam Jamil Al-Amin, a political prisoner right now in the US, formerly known as Rap Brown, once said, that violence is as American as cherry pie. And this is true. The enslavement of African people and their introduction into the so-called New World began when the Europeans began to colonize and conquer the North American landmass. Now we have to understand something. That African people that were brought to what would become the United States came from different parts of Africa, speaking different languages, having different religious beliefs and faiths and cultural differences, but we were melded into one people, having one history in the crucible of chattel slavery and white supremacy. And this is very important to remember, because the African diaspora, which some of you represent, was not a coincidence. It is a direct consequence of European imperialism, empire, and the social construct of white supremacy. Law enforcement today in the United States has its roots in this history. When we see time after time on the internet and on our cell phones, African men and women being murdered, brutally killed by law enforcement, we ask ourselves, well, how is this possible? Why does this continue? And the answer is very simple. Law enforcement in the United States today has its auspices and its origins in the slave trade, in the appropriation of black bodies for the benefit of the ruling elite and the owners of property. You know, some of you may have heard about the Constitution of the United States. Purportedly, it's the greatest document ever penned by human beings. Let white folks tell it. And it's on par with the Magna Carta. Well, we know what happened in Europe after the Magna Carta, now don't we? How the bourgeoisie and the business class rose to power, and we have what we have today. But the Constitution of the United States had a clause in it that said that all men, and they used men, so all you women in here, yeah, you should shake your head talking about it. I knew they was on some misogynist shit. Yeah, they said all men, and they meant all men. They ain't mean women. They said all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there was a clause, and this clause was political. This clause was economic. This clause reflected the white supremacist social construct of colonialism, of European hegemony and ownership of property. And that clause said that all men are created equal except African slaves, who are 3/5 of a human being. 3/5. Now, some people would say that, well, what did that mean? You know, what did that mean, that you weren't a whole person, that a slave wasn't? No. What it meant was that the owners of the plantation class, the agricultural ownership class, the owners of the cotton plantations and the sugar plantations, they had a right to vote. And each property owner who was a white male had one vote. But if he owned African slaves, and he owned 3 of them, or 5 of them, he would have an additional vote, because this was his property. This was very unique. You could own 4 cows, but that didn't give you another vote. But if you owned an African, that was your property. And if you owned enough Africans, you can have more votes. So that meant that the large plantation owners in the South could wield their power even though they were small in number. Because there was a point in the development of the plantation system in which African chattel slaves outnumbered their owners. This is important to understand, because when we listen today to the cry, Black Lives Matter, we have to understand the roots of that cry, of that slogan. White people owned black bodies, and they had the right to do with those bodies whatever they wanted to. That ownership of an African reflected the wealth of the owner, reflected the political power of the owner. And law enforcement that arose out of this system had its first organization around the slave patrols. You know, the slave patrols were such that if an African was found off of the property, off of the plantation at certain hours of the day, any white person could stop this African and demand some identification or an explanation as to why they were there. Why weren't they home on their plantation? And who did they belong to? This is the mentality that led to the kneeling in the neck of George Floyd. These crackers still think they own us. These crackers still think our bodies belong to them. And so when organizations come along that demand that black people defend themselves against this atrocious dehumanization, we are labeled thugs, criminals, and violent prone. White Americans think they have a right to kill us, to own us. And so when the plea goes up after the Trayvon Martin trial, in which the murderer of Trayvon Martin got away based on the defense, was acquitted based on the defense of stand your ground, that he had the right, that white people have the right to stand their ground against attack. Not to mention the fact that Trayvon Martin was attacked, not the white person. But anyway, he was acquitted. And a hue and cry went up. A hashtag came on the internet, Black Lives Matter. And when Ferguson erupted after the murder of Mike Brown, Black Lives Matter's hashtag became national. People marched through the streets, black people and whites marched through the streets protesting the murder of Michael Brown. However, we need to understand one thing, that hashtag movements are not liberation movements. That you cannot organize a people's movement and a people's liberation struggle on the internet. So this was then and this is now. When the Black Panther Party first emerged on the set in 1966, the Black Panther Party I'm talking about in Oakland, California, that was founded by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. When the Black Panther Party emerged on the set in 1966, it declared that black people had the right to self-defense, that we had the right to arm ourselves, to defend ourselves against a system that did not value our bodies and our humanity. Now, you know, to that frontier mentality that I just alluded to, white folks said, who are these people that have the audacity to talk about defending themselves? And if we understand anything about oppressive systems, we know that oppressive systems are always based on fear of the other. And the most fearful image in the minds of white Americans are black people with guns. You don't know how that's terrifying, because just imagine a plantation owner on an 18th century plantation, and all of his workers are black. There may be hundreds of them. And when he goes to sleep at night, he's thinking about maybe that last nigger that I whipped might sneak into the house with a big cutlass and chop us to pieces. So the fear of armed slaves, of armed revolt, of armed slaves was a paramount fear that motivated institutionalized white supremacy. White supremacy in the United States, our brothers and sisters, is not just an existential creation. It is a characteristic of capitalism, of exploitation of labor. It's an expression of how those who are in control of property and the means of production should deal with unpaid labor. Now, you know, there was a civil war in the United States, and that civil war wasn't about country and duty and honor. That civil war was about maintaining the system of chattel slavery. When America was at a particular point in its economic development, it had accumulated so much wealth out of cotton and sugarcane that it began the process of industrialization that had just started in England and Europe. And a prerequisite of modern industrialization was wage slavery, was a working class. And of course, Africans were prohibited from reading. And you could not have an illiterate working class in a modern industrial society. They had to be educated. They had to at least be able to read the instructions in the steel mill. So the contradiction of the Civil War was basically between wage slavery and chattel slavery. America had to move from an agricultural basis and economic system to an industrial system, and it needed educated workers. And chattel slavery, free labor, undercut wage slavery or wage labor. So a war was fought. It was fought to not only maintain the economic integrity of the United States, it was fought also to maintain the political union of the United States. Part of the consequences of that was the Emancipation Proclamation. But let's be clear, when Abraham Lincoln's so-called Emancipation Bill was passed, Emancipation Proclamation was read out, the only part of that that was relevant to the capitalists, to the industrialists, to the plantation owners, was the ownership of the slave. Chattel was left off. It was written out, but the word slave remained. And it remained in the form of the 13th Amendment that legalized servitude for commission of a crime. So the South, after the Civil War, adopted a semi-feudal system called sharecropping. Because the agricultural basis of the South was now disrupted, the plantation owners no longer had access to free labor. The millions and thousands of former African slaves who were in the South were reduced to feudal peasantry. They could work the land, but they couldn't own the land. It was called sharecropping. They had a share in the crops that they worked the land on. And most of these sharecropping arrangements were on the same plantation they were once chattel slaves. And the police had moved to a whole new level. Controlling black flesh and black bodies had moved to a whole different level now, after the Civil War. Now, if an African was off the plantation and didn't have identification, he could be arrested and placed in prison on a chain gang, and the members of the chain gang, mostly black, were then rented out to the local farmer to work his land. The white folks is deep. They come up with some shit. They know how to reform some oppression now. And we're coming. I'm trying to show you that a system that was erected like this only could last but so long. As the United States became more powerful and industrialization became more prevalent, many people moved out of the South and moved into the urban North and into the cities, into Detroit, into New York, into areas of industrial production. And black folks moved with them. There was this great migration to the urban cities. And when black laborers, half-educated, arrived in the urban North, they found housing only in particular areas allocated to them. So if you think gentrification didn't have its roots in slavery, think again. So black people came to the urban areas, the industrial areas, and they were shuttled into bandustans, for a better word, into segregated communities with inferior housing, inferior infrastructure. And they were hired as cheap labor. These ghettos became domestic colonies in essence. And they had to be controlled. They had to be policed. I guess I'm the only one that don't have their phone turned off, right? My bad. I apologize. And police in the urban areas in the early period of industrialization in America, the police came from ethnic gangs. Because then America had influxes of Europeans that came from Europe, from Ireland, from Italy, from Germany, from Britain. And so America imported Europeans, gave them land that they had stolen from the native people, and gave them jobs as industrial workers, pushing out the labor of former African slaves. So what was to be done with all these Africans in these urban areas who only could get menial jobs? Well, a system of Jim Crow was erected. And this system of Jim Crow basically modified or reformed the system of rural sharecropping and segregated black people into certain communities, gave them particularly low-paying jobs, non-union jobs, because unionization at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, was a new thing. And who were the unionizers? Who were the organizers for labor to wage the conditions of wage slavery in America that was being implemented and instituted by the so-called robber barons, the Mellons, the Rockefellers, the Morgans? Who were they? They were communists. They were the sons and daughters of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. They believed in the Marxian theory that the working class was a revolutionary class, that workers should be organized. And they did begin to organize white workers into unions. And unions rose up across America. But to the ownership class, to the robber barons, unions were anathema. Unions was basically usurping their ability to use surplus labor, the profits from surplus labor, for their own disposal and for their own benefit. So unionization in America was a very violent thing. Workers were killed and murdered. And what was the purpose of black workers in all of this? We were used to break unions. Whenever workers went on strike, they would immediately hire black workers to pass through the union striking picket lines and go to work and keep the business going. So white workers began to attack black strike breakers. They fought against black workers. They didn't allow black workers and black people, the descendants of slaves, into their union. So here was a whole nother fight now for us. We not only didn't have the right to vote in the South, we didn't even have the right to unionize labor in the North. And all of these discrepancies, all of these divisions, we had to wage a struggle to rectify and change. And I tell you, brothers and sisters, every change in America that has benefited the masses of people, the underclass, women, the disenfranchised, every development of human and civil rights in America came as a consequence of the struggles of people of African ancestry in America for their humanity and human dignity.